What's happening, everybody? James Hancock here, back to discuss the ongoing adventures of James Keziah Delaney, aka the character played by Tom Hardy in the new show Taboo, which in America here is played on FX. Now that the first episode's been up for a week, a lot of people have had a chance to chime in. Seems like there are a lot of people who are very intrigued, not a lot of people that are totally, completely in love with the show, but people that really, really like the show. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Not every show right out of the gate is going to grab millions of viewers like Game of Thrones. This is a cool, well written show set in a very interesting period with lots of darkness and corruption. But it's definitely got a bit of a slow burn in terms of the pacing, so it's not going to be a Walking Dead success right out of the gate. But I do think it will find a loyal, steadfast audience in the weeks to come. Because I thought the second episode absolutely lived up to the promise that was initially suggested by the first episode. Perhaps some people are holding it to a very, very high standard because it's got so much talent involved. It's got Ridley Scott as a producer. It's got Tom Hardy and his father, Chips Hardy, coming up with the concept. It's got Stephen Knight as one of the writers and directors. So when you assemble that much great talent, actors like Jonathan Pryce and people like that, people are going to hold you to a very high standard, whether that's fair or not. But I think on the whole, this show absolutely is delivering. It's mean as a snake. It's violent, at times very sexy, establishes the period setting beautifully, and I find myself riveted whenever I'm watching it. So I'm in. So it's hard to talk about it beyond that without giving away spoilers. So this review portion is now over, and I'm going to be going into officially the recap. So as we saw in the last episode, James Delaney has returned from his travels abroad because his father has died, and his father owned the land that is going to be hotly debated between Britain and America as they kind of debate the border between Canada and America as the War of 1812 draws to a close. And the East India Company desperately wants this land. They're pissed as hell that James Delaney won't even consider their offers, and they essentially put out a hit on him to kill him. For people who don't know, the East India Company was a vast organization with property all over the world, with their own private army and fleet and so on and so forth. It basically was the largest company from the era of British imperialism. They're the kind of people you don't want to have as your enemy, especially if you're just one kind of crazy guy covered in tattoos with resources, but still, you're one man. His main nemesis, Sir Stuart Strange, is played by Jonathan Pryce, and Jonathan Pryce believes that James is in league with the Americans, or as he describes them, or us, the fucking Americans, because he's obviously not the biggest fan of folks from the US of A during the War of 1812, and so on and so forth. But it's interesting seeing Tom Hardy go around London and essentially taking care of business, whether that is investigating the poisoning of his father or buying his own ship so that he can start creating his own company from scratch. He's essentially just positioning himself to clean up his father's affairs and make sure he has as strong a claim as humanly possible on his father's land, because the big debate is if it was a matter of conquest, the crown can claim it. But if it was a matter of trade and negotiation, then his claim is ironclad, or as ironclad as it might be, given what is revealed at the end of the episode, but more on that in a second. One of the fun parts of this episode is that we get to see James Delaney in kind of saboteur mode. You also get to see him buck-ass naked with all of his crazy tattoos, and he blows up a ship that was involved in the trading of the poison of his father. If I'm understanding that part of the plot correctly, I believe I am. But there are times where this story can be a little vague, and also he sometimes drifts in and out of dreams and flashbacks. He, in particular, has these really, really intense dreams of being on a ship in the rain with a lot of slaves behind bars, and my theory is that obviously he was on the ship at some point and it sank with people that he felt a kinship toward, because he spent a lot of time in Africa and not always mingling amongst the white folks. He clearly feels a kinship with a lot of people that he was adventuring with and exploring, but more on that to come, I'm sure, in future episodes. This episode has some great gallows humor appropriate to its era. At one point, James Delaney jokes to his manservant or butler that in Parliament they're debating whether or not people are allowed to beat their servants. And James cracks that surely anarchy will ensue if you're no longer allowed to beat those in your employ. This episode also gives us Stephen Graham as Atticus. Stephen Graham's a phenomenal actor. I mean, I first started to become a fan of his back in Snatch, the Guy Ritchie film, and he's this savage ne'er-do-well who is kind of on James Delaney's side, but clearly is going to be kind of his eyes and ears. He's just yet another member of this phenomenal ensemble cast. We also learn a little bit more about the ongoing conflict between the U.S. and Britain, and we see that the Americans have actually set up a blockade between Ireland and England, and they're being supplied gunpowder and supplies by the Irish. And it just gives you an idea of the broad scope of this conflict in which James finds himself mired. I like the fact that we're getting the kind of the bird's eye view of what's happening and James' small but pivotal role in the both escalation and resolution of the conflict at hand. Speaking of the Americans, we get the introduction of Michael Kelly as a character named Dumbarton, who's kind of an American spy slash doctor living in London, and James comes to see him and knows some of the code words or some of the old code words for speaking with the Americans, and he essentially says he wants to open up a dialogue between himself and the president of the 15 United States of America. That's how far back we're going, 15 states. And he gets thrown out because Michael Kelly's, or Dumbarton's, not 100% sold on whether or not Tom Hardy can be trusted. But it was easily the strongest scene in the episode for me, and I remember at one point I just found myself screaming like, I fucking love this show, during their exchange. It's why I'm going to be coming back for this show again and again and again for confrontations like these. The big climax of this episode deals with the rather corrupt lawyer for James's father. But as they're reading the will of James's father, James essentially offers to settle all of his father's debts. It is unveiled that everything in his father's inheritance is going straight to James until an actress emerges from Ireland who claims to have married James's father in the final days or weeks of his life. Therefore, she's entitled to half of his estate. This is confirmed, but James is somewhat skeptical because his father was crazy and old, and he's doubtful about whether or not the marriage was ever consummated. East India Company is thrilled because they realize now if they take out James by assassination that they'll only have to negotiate with her and she'll probably be more reasonable. The episode ends with James and his sister talking about, or half-sister, talking about some of their previous flings or some weird kinky shit going on that front. And spoiler alert, we see an assassin coming after James. And it's the first real great solid bit of action we've seen in the show. A cool exchange in the dark with them, knife thrusts and some combat, and then it ends with James literally biting out the throat of his opponent. Very mean, savage stuff. But as he pulls away, he realizes he's got a big giant knife in his gut and he collapses. And the episode draws to a close. Nice cliffhanger ending. Across the board, just a very, very solid show. Am I going to come out right and say that it's True Detective or Sopranos or Game of Thrones? No. But it's definitely good, solid storytelling that's reliable and entertaining, and sufficiently dark and brooding for my perverse sense of entertainment. And I love all the history involved. I love all the strategy involved. I love the ensemble cast. Thumbs up for Taboo. Highly recommend it. Hope everyone is enjoying it if you're watching it. And if you haven't, take a crack at the first episode. You never know. You might really enjoy it. So hope you enjoyed this video. Give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax if you want to talk about flicks or movies or comics or video games or whatever. And I'll be back at you next week to talk about episode 3 of Taboo. So long.